Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, welcome. Thank you very much for being here today. My name is Foli Batibo, principal presenter on Al Jazeera English television. I'd first and foremost like to thank the Brookings Doha Center for organizing this policy discussion on peace and justice in the Arab world. I know we're all looking forward to what will hopefully be a very insightful conversation. Now, before we begin, a few housekeeping matters. Please turn your phones off, put them on silent if you can. If you require translation, you have a kit next to your seat. Turn the knob on 1 for Arabic, 2 for English. The discussion will be followed by a question and answer session, during which you'll have the opportunity to share your views and ask questions to our panelists here. So we hope you do have some interesting questions to ask. And we also hope you stay with us after the discussion for a little reception that will follow this discussion today. Thank you very much for being here. Now, 2011 was a pivotal year for the Arab world. It was a year that saw an unprecedented outburst of popular protests and demand for reform. It began, as you know, in Tunisia and within weeks spread to Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain. People in the region had never seen anything like it before. The dramatic images of massive anti-government protests from Cairo to Manama lit up television screens around the world. Long-standing authoritarian leaders, including Tunisia's Ben Ali and Egypt's Hosni Mubarak, were forced from power by people power. The impossible had become reality. But perhaps even more shocking and unimaginable for people were the live images on television a few months later. August 2011, Hosni Mubarak, dressed in white, in a courtroom cage, flanked by his 2 sons, his interior minister, and several aides, having to answer to a judge. 2 months earlier, in Tunisia, Ben Ali was tried in absentia, having fled the country once the protests began. In Libya, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for 5 Gaddafi regime officials, including his son, Saif al-Islam. In the case of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh agreed to step down from power in a deal that granted him immunity from prosecution. So, Arab leaders were being put on trial. Their prosecution emerged as the single most pursued goal for transitional justice. Actors, including the state, civil society, and victims, were finally beginning the process of addressing past injustice. Now, for many people around the world, this was powerful proof that the revolutions had succeeded. But had they? Was the toppling of these leaders, their trial, and in the case of Gaddafi, their death, enough for a meaningful transitional justice process to unfold? Well, it's now, 6 years since the start of the Arab Spring, and this is what the pursuit of transitional justice looks like. In Tunisia, which, as you know, is hailed as the success story of the Arab Spring, there's a new constitution and some action has been taken to address past crimes, but human rights are still under attack, and many say urgent reforms are needed. In Egypt, hundreds have been sentenced to death. Thousands are in prison for protesting or for their alleged links to the Muslim Brotherhood and other political opposition groups. In Libya, you have a deeply polarized political and military conflict. Militias have thrived, state institutions have collapsed, the justice sector is dysfunctional, and perhaps most importantly, in Libya, in 6 years, none of the ICC targets have faced judges at The Hague. And of course, you have Syria, which is still reeling from war in which hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, millions displaced in what has become the worst humanitarian crisis since the end of the Second World War. Russia and China vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that would have brought the Syria situation, that would have referred the Syria situation to the ICC. Yemen too, war rages on in Yemen. More than 10,000 people killed, and many rights groups saying some of the attacks there by both the Saudi-led coalition and Houthi rebels amount to war crimes. And we've just heard today that human rights groups are calling on the UN to blacklist the Saudi-led coalition for crimes, for violations against children in Yemen. So basically, in almost all these cases, neither peace nor justice appears to have materialized. And perhaps even more worrying, even more of concern, is that nowhere in the region has transitional justice of any form been pursued for crimes that existed before the Arab Spring, which leads us to ask a number of questions that we hope we'll be able to debate extensively this evening. One of them being, to what extent can we actually talk about a transition after the Arab Spring? How should transitional justice be pursued when political and judicial institutions are weak and leaders, for the most part, have not been held accountable to their citizens? And also, can there be transitional justice if there is no democratic process? Whose interests drive transitional justice decisions? This panel will discuss these questions as well as the merits of the peace versus justice debate in the context of the Arab Spring. We'll also explore the fundamental questions of social justice, reconciliation, and healing. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists to us. To my left first, Frej Fenish, who's former director of the Asia Pacific, Middle East, and North Africa branch of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. He's also worked with the Tunisian League for Human Rights and was the director of the Arab Institute for Human Rights and has worked as well with the World Organization Against Torture. Noha Abouel Dahab is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center. She has researched extensively on transitional justice in the Arab region. Her book, Transitional Justice and the Prosecution of the Political Leaders in the Arab Region, will be out tomorrow. You can order a copy today if you want. Also with us, Abdul Salam Mohammed, chairman of the Abad Studies and Research Center, which is based in Sana'a. He's an advisor as well in Yemen's Ministry of Information and contributing author of the book Al-Qaeda in Yemen, published in 2010. He's delivered a number of lectures around the world on the future of Yemen after the Arab Spring, as well as on war and terrorism. And last but not least, Marieke Verder, who's a Dutch lawyer specializing in transitional justice. She was born and raised in Yemen and is a former transitional justice advisor for the United Nations Support Mission in Libya. Thank you all for being here. We very much look forward to hearing your insight and your experience on how to approach transitional justice, the issues of peace, justice, and reconciliation, as well as institutional reform in the Arab region. You'll each have 10 minutes to present your views and thoughts to us. And then later I'll have a few questions for you, and we'll also have questions from our audience here. So thank you very much for being here. So let me start with you, Frej Fenish, and I want to hear about the Tunisian experience. Tunisia, of course, is hailed as the success story, a relative success story for the Arab Spring. What makes Tunisia a model when it comes to transitional justice?
Yeah, thank you very much, Folly, for this very comprehensive framework and introduction to this issue. And thank you for Doha Brookings Center for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to interact with this very important audience. Thank you for your presence too. I will make it in Arabic, as it's better for me and easier to express my views in Arabic. So please.
Is the Tunisian experience, relatively speaking, a success story or not? And what makes it a success story? In the beginning, I think until now we can say that the experiment is successful and it's achieving some degrees of successes. So in this sense, it is successful until we reach the end. Yet, ironically, regarding the Tunisian experience, it was Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali, the former president, who started the mechanisms for achieving transitional justice only 2 days before he fled the country. In actual fact, the path to transitional justice did not start after the revolution. It started in the and the last days of Ben Ali's rule. Then the investigative committee on corruption, another committee on political reform, these commissions or committees were established. And this is one of the ironic sides to the Tunisian experience. After Ben Ali fled the country, the situation reflected the chaos Tunisia went through after Ben Ali's departure from the country. First of all, the prime minister and some ministers stayed in power. Then there was agreement on a new government with certain tasks, and also, in addition to that, the transitional government 2011, under the pressure from the street and the circumstances, took some decisions which can be considered as part and parcel of transitional justice. Although these decisions and the laws which were passed were somewhat done hastily, like for example the questions on compensation for victims of political prisoners and wounded in the events surrounding the revolution. Also a question of amnesty to some people. Events after that developed, and when they started preparing for the elections. In this context, the civil society and organizations defending the rights of victims played a fundamental role in pushing the process of transitional justice in the right direction. There was a political will on the part of political parties which formed this committee, which was later on named the Supreme Committee for Democratization and the Achievement of the Aims and Objectives of the Revolution, which acted like a de facto parliament in an attempt to protect the aims of the revolution and to protect those who were engaged in revolutionary activity. These committees had some credibility because certain personalities were appointed to lead them, like for example the former Association for the Defense of Human Rights and others who are well known and well respected in the country. Then Abdel Fattah Amr, the late Abdel Fattah Amr, who was a former member of the United Nations on Human Rights. As for political reform, Mr. Ayad bin Ashur, who is the deputy chairman of the UN's Commission on Political and Civil Rights. This has given some credibility to these committees, and within this process the civil society was pushing towards an important mechanism, an independent mechanism in four directions. First of all, investigating any violations. Secondly, holding people accountable, and also to put an end to a culture of impunity from justice, and of fourthly compensation for those who suffered, and also the whole question of transitional justice should contribute to the establishment of the kind of political system which will not allow in the future of a repetition of these things, or the establishment of political system which can allow for violations. After the Constituent Assembly passed a new constitution, which is a source of pride for all of us Tunisians, like equality between men and women, guarantees on human rights, including the establishment of a Truth and Dignity Commission, which later on was tasked with dealing with the question or the process of transitional justice. What contributed to the success of the Tunisian experience is, first of all, the law pertaining to the law which was passed by Parliament was really very strong and gave committees strong powers, including immunity for its members, and also the right to have access to any information, whether it's in the possession of a security organization or a government body, and they were empowered to punish those who refuse to provide it with the information it requires. So investigation, compensation, reconciliation, and preparing recommendations for reforming the political system in a way which allows for a democratic society. These are important things, and I will conclude by talking about 2 points: the peculiarity of transitional justice in Tunisia and the specificities, and also the obstacles and challenges. As for the question of crimes which the committee was tasked with dealing with, they're huge crimes, and we are talking about serious violations, rape, torture, etc. But because of the political balancing in parliament and public debate, all of this led the committee to call or to say that all elections from independence until then were rigged and falsified. And secondly, it dealt with corruption issues. And this is a rare thing in the world when Truth and Reconciliation committees deal with corruption, financial and economic corruption. As for the challenges, the sheer magnitude of the tasks given to this committee meant that the 4 years given to it were not enough, although it was extended for a year. Also, the transitional justice is a process, but events keep on happening. There are political, social, economic problems. There is unemployment. All of this led the public losing interest in transitional justice. Also, there are indications that at the government level now there is less interest and less support of the process. Finally, amongst the challenges also is the makeup or the structure of the whole thing. Unfortunately, the law allows the parliament the right to elect these members, and the parliament is established on a quota system, And there is all this debate on identity, who is Islamist, who is leftist, who is this and who is that. All of this impacted the structure of the committee, and this may cause it some problems in its work. Thank you.
It's very interesting to hear about the Tunisian example and also some of the obstacles that you still see. And I do want to ask you later on about the resurgence of the old regime. The current president is from the former Bourguiba government, and whether the resurgence of the old regime in Tunisia is an impediment to the pursuit of transitional justice. I'll get to ask you about that in just a few minutes. Let me now bring in Noha Abu El Dahab. Noha, you've traveled extensively across the region to Egypt, Yemen, Tunisia, conducting interviews with the actors on the ground, with people. What's been your takeaway? Can there be transitional justice if there is no democratic transition?
Well, thank you, Foley, and thank you everyone for coming, and thanks to the Brookings Doha Center for hosting this event and for hosting me as a visiting fellow. Many of you will remember the very sort of powerful images of the former Egyptian president Hosni Mubarak in a cage, as Foley eloquently described earlier, in a courtroom on the first day of his trial in August 2011. So fast forward to 6 years later, and he went from being sentenced to life in prison in 2012 for the charge of complicity in the killing of the protesters in the Egyptian uprising, to being found innocent of this charge and set free in March earlier this year. So for the thousands of victims of the Mubarak era, that image of Mubarak and his aides in the courtroom didn't deliver the justice that they were seeking, and I will come back to this point a little bit later. Meanwhile, the other former Egyptian president, Mohamed Morsi, was also put on trial following his ouster in 2013. Now, Morsi faces a host of charges, but one of the charges that really sort of stood out for me is he was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor for the arbitrary detention, torture, and killing of protesters outside the presidential palace in Cairo during some clashes in 2012. And then, as we heard earlier, a couple of months before the Mubarak trial, former Tunisian President Ben Ali was put on trial in absentia. A number of other high-level Tunisian government officials were also put on trial. The ICC issued arrest warrants in Libya. Yemen was going through the motions of passing an immunity law to protect its former president from prosecution, and so on. So during a conversation I was having with a very prominent scholar of transitional justice at a conference in 2013, I asked her what she thought of the status of transitional justice in the Arab region. And I'm using the term transitional justice here very loosely, really, to mean a reckoning with the past or addressing past crimes and atrocities. So when I asked her what she thought of the status of transitional justice in the region, she said, you can't have transitional justice without a transition. And this statement didn't sit very, very well with me because, given all the developments that were happening in the region, the wheels of transitional justice were very much in motion. In the stark contrast between the Mubarak and the Morsi trials, or the M&M trials, as I like to call them, brings me to this first point, that transitional justice can and indeed has been pursued in non-democratic transitions to, on the one hand, entrench authoritarian rule, and on the other hand, as a powerful tool used by civil society, lawyers, activists, victims, to resist the resurgence of authoritarianism. Secondly, certainly in Egypt, but I think this applies to a number of other cases as well, there has been a reckoning with the transition itself, as opposed to the decades of violations that led, to the uprisings and to the transition. If you look, for example, at the charges and the flurry of prosecutions that took place in Egypt, specifically the human rights charges, they're very limited to the period of the uprising, the killing of protesters during an 18-day period. And I think this, this had three there are three important points here. One is that this was a way for the interim and the post-transition authorities in Egypt to protect themselves from their role and their responsibility in pre-transition crimes. So they didn't want to dig too far back. Secondly, these highly symbolic prosecutions, whether it's Mubarak or the former Interior Minister Habib al-Adli and others, was a way to sacrifice a part of the regime to save the regime, as one person put it to me. And third, it was also a way, this sort of limited scope of transitional justice was a way to portray the 18 days, those 18 days in 2011 as an exceptional period, as though all the decades of violations before that didn't exist. So, unlike transitions in other parts of the world, there were no democratic or transparent institutions to begin with. And this applies to, pretty much all the countries in the region. And this is why I think, the Arab Spring was in many ways a struggle against post-colonial authoritarianism. And it's interesting that in Tunisia, for the Truth Commission there, it extended its mandate to cover crimes since independence in 1955. This didn't happen in Egypt, of course, at least not yet. So there's a major challenge here, which is the use of deep state institutions to account for the past. And this presents an additional problem, which is how to manage the justice expectations of victims. So let's go back to my earlier point. If your mother or your father or your brother or sister, son or daughter were tortured, killed, disappeared for simply expressing a view that didn't sit well with the authorities, chances are you're going to want to see that this perpetrator or the person who committed this crime held criminally accountable. But would you still want that if you knew that the trial would be ineffective, unjust, and unfair? So, I've painted a very depressing picture here, but before we all go and take a Prozac pill, I think that we can find some hope in an unlikely example, which is Syria. Now, Syrian civil society and Syrian lawyers and victims and families of victims and eyewitnesses have made heroic efforts to document violations that have been perpetrated there since 2011. And of course, this is just sort of one example that I'm giving. And this documentation not only preserves their stories of victimhood for the history books, but it's really just golden material for future prosecutions. And indeed, it has been used for ongoing prosecutions in Europe through this universal jurisdiction mechanism. So transitional justice is a process, right? It's not an outcome. And I think that, it takes time. Look at Argentina. Argentina is still prosecuting officials from its military dictatorship more than 30 years ago. Brazil, in 2014, established the Truth Commission that used a report with allegations of torture and other violations that was published 30 years prior to that. Issa Nabré, president of Chad, he was tried 26 years later in Senegal. So it takes time. And so I think that, perhaps there's something to be said about, pursuing other avenues such as documentation, as opposed to, pushing for prosecutions through an unjust justice system. Thank you.
Syrian example, and Noha, I want to ask you later about the role the international community plays in the pursuit of peace and justice in the Arab region, particularly because we know what happened with Syria. The Syria case wasn't brought before the International Criminal Court, as was the case in Libya, because of the veto by Russia and China. And I want to talk to you a bit later about the role of the international community in helping pursue peace and justice in this region. Right now, though, let's hear from Abdul Salam Mohammed, who is from Yemen. And with you, Abdul Salam, I want to focus on the question of transitional justice in an ongoing conflict, because it may seem antithetical to discuss issues of transitional justice when Yemen is struggling with an ongoing war. We've had 10,000 people killed in Yemen despite the immunity deal that was given to the president that was supposed to ensure a smooth transition. So the question I want to ask you is, do we talk about transitional justice when there is a war, or do we wait for violence to subside in Yemen before pursuing justice?
Assalamu alaikum. I'll be speaking in Arabic. I think anybody who hears Yemen mentioned in front of them, their mind will go to different things. First of all, the tribe and the tribal system, then the weakness of the governing regime, or the militias, whether we're talking about the Houthis or the terrorists or anybody. This is the image which is present in the minds of many people, but there is, however, another image. If we talk about transitional justice in Yemen, it is a bit of a luxury, really, talking about that in view of the situation. The Yemenis cannot achieve transitional justice in the absence of a proper state. What we have is a very fragile system, and contrary to the norms in other countries, we have the tribal system, which has its own sort of judicial system and reconciliation. This may be put into use and benefited from to create some sort of a replacement for the state. If we go back to 2011, when the youth of Yemen went out on a peaceful revolution, which was not armed, which was not militarized, but it has exposed the real situation in Yemen, and incidents of revenge started being talked about as part and parcel of the revolution. But those who are in power, they want to keep their power. They enter into a cycle of confrontation with the revolution, and this confrontation started. So instead of conflict being between this tribe and another tribe, it became a conflict between the state and the society, which exposed the fragility and the weakness of the state. And the process of reconciliation in Yemen started when the youth of the revolution agreed to leave the squares where they were protesting in favor of the GCC initiative. And accepting that did not mean that they were forced to accept a transition of power, but what it meant, really, they accepted a peaceful transition. And what reinforced this, there was an international resolution, that is, by the Security Council, which I think this was in 2014, or the resolution number was 2014 in 2011, which forced forced the government to give up power. And from that day on was this attempt to circumvent the whole process of transitional justice, and instead of the state working to make it a success, making the process of transitional justice a success, they started dismantling the state, especially when the militias took control of the state, especially so when after the GCC initiative, the law of immunity from prosecution was passed, which is a law, a sovereign law that nobody can evade, which stated that the former president Ali Abdullah Saleh was given absolute immunity, not only personally for him, but all those who worked with him, and in every matter except terrorism. This was a double-edged knife. Some started thinking that the transition process started through a process of national reconciliation. Others saw it as the beginning of Ali Abdullah Saleh getting away with what he did with all the crimes, and this may have encouraged the state to go on in shedding blood, and especially when the law now has given the president absolute impunity from any attempts to prosecute him. Of course, there were resolutions by the UN initiatives to help Yemenis, but in actual fact, we ended up with a situation whereby the state collapsed, and there was this military coup, and the militias took full control of the state, and everything got out of the hands of the state, and now, of course, we are in a situation of war, not peace. And any talk of transitional justice is seen by many Yemenis as a sort of luxury. Now we cannot afford. Every attention now should be focused on stopping the war, and if we wanted to apply transitional justice in all its forms, whether by accepting reconciliation or trying those who committed war crimes, in either case you need to restore the state first. We in Yemen, we are a tribal country. We know once the state disappears, the tribe takes over, and vice versa. If the state is strong, the tribe retreats as an institution. But the problem is throughout the last decades, our politicians have failed on two accounts. They neither could turn the tribal system into an urbanized system, civil system, neither could they build a strong enough state to run the affairs of the country in the absence of the tribal system. So therefore, Yemen is drifting really. This is a serious situation, and the international community is required, first of all, to end the war, then restore the state, then we can talk about transitional justice and whether that can be achieved by calling into operation the role of the tribes and some norms in society which can contribute to a process of reconciliation, or to use international law and humanitarian law and other Chapter 7 resolutions which will force the process of a transition. What we need, first of all, is ending the war, achieving peace, so that transitional justice can take place in the presence of a state, not in the current situation. Shukran lak.
Peace first in Yemen before we can actually talk about a transitional justice process. I know some of our panelists here might not necessarily agree with that point, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Let me bring in Marika now, Marika Vera, who has worked with the transitional justice process in Libya. And talk to us about the Libyan experience, because the United Nations Security Council unanimously, of course, referred the situation in Libya to the ICC. A number of arrest warrants were issued for former Gaddafi regime officials. But in 6 years, Marika, none of the ICC's targets in Libya have ever faced judges in The Hague. So what went wrong with Libya? And what does this say also about the ICC? Are they opportunistic in their approach?
Thank you very much, and thank you in particular to the Brookings Doha Institute for hosting us. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion. I should clarify, I'm currently working for the Dutch Foreign Ministry, but I'll be speaking in my personal capacity to contribute to this conversation. And of course, as observed, Libya is a country where neither peace nor justice has prevailed. But instead of being the usual pessimistic analyst, let me take you from optimism, then to some pessimism, and then back to optimism, if I may. Because if we start at the beginning, if you remember 2011, in many ways, Libya was, in some senses, the most hopeful of the Arab transitions, because it was at least a complete transition. To begin with, it was a revolution in a sense, so that the old was truly overthrown and the new came in. Also, if you look at it purely legally or mechanistically, you can say that Libya went through a lot of the motions of the transitional justice, let's say, menu. So they had, in fact, prosecutions of senior former regime figures in case 177 in the court in Tripoli. They, of course, contested admissibility against the ICC in The Hague, successfully in the case of Senussi. They had several laws to set up fact-finding and reconciliation commissions, first through the NTC, Law 17, then the GNC passed Law 29. They passed some laws for compensation, including Law 50, which was to compensate former political prisoners. They had a ministry for missing persons and for martyrs of the revolution. They had institutional reform in the form of the political isolation, which I'm happy to discuss further. I'm fairly critical of what they did with that. But they had the whole set. So what really did go wrong? And here, I think we need to reflect a moment, because transitional justice is not about the what. It's not about running down the list of mechanisms and ticking all the boxes. It's a lot about the how. And what we can say, I think, is that in Libya, these efforts, they failed to contribute to renewing a social contract between citizen and state. And in fact, they failed to renew trust in public institutions. And as many of you know, Hisham Attar is now the winner of the Pulitzer Prize, a Libyan. He has written, "Nothing is more acceptable than what we are born into." And here, I think this applies to Libya, because Libya had this extensive history of 42 years of a dictatorship. And I think this is given two reasons why things have gone awry. The first is that these 42 years contributed really to dismantling the state institutions. As some people have said, Gaddafi was the state. And the citizens could not trust the state, because it, unless they really aligned with it, then it attacked them on all levels, not just on basic civil and political rights, but also, for instance, property rights. Many properties were confiscated under the so-called Law Number 4, which said that you own the house you live in. This was a radical restructuring of the society. And as a result, I think, of that very fundamentally broken social contract during those 42 years, when the revolution happened, many Libyans, in fact, sided more with their communities and their regions and other forms of identity rather than their national identity. And some also with ideological groups, or they found safety in that. And this, in turn, really enabled the militia structures to thrive, because these militias were representing these identities. And I have to say, and this is a mea culpa and a point of criticism for the UN and for UNSMIL, I think in the early years there was great hope that the militias would somehow fall in line with the central government, and that they would slowly but surely come under the wing of the state. But this didn't happen. And that was, I think, a calculation flaw. A second reason is my own personal reflection also. I think Libya suffered from a revolutionary euphoria in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Gaddafi regime. And I think that euphoria, in fact, impeded progress. Why? Because in essence, it enabled, for instance, a climate of revenge. So 6,000 people were put in detention. Many of them remain there today. They were considered somehow associated with the regime. But many of these files were not strong criminal cases. Also, the political isolation law was part of this climate. I would call it of vengeance. The militias, of course, became increasingly powerful because they were often exercising this vengeance. And this left citizens unprotected. And although there had been many constructive efforts, like in Yemen, in Libya, through tribal leaders or community leaders and elders, but they could not patch the peace in Libya together. So Libya remained fragmented, and the justice system was attacked. In the east, it became quickly rather non-functional, and in the west, it dispensed flawed and partial justice, including in the case of the former regime members. So in a sense, my critique also extends to the international community, because I think the institutions have certainly, to some extent, the UN, although the UN, of course, changed with the times, but also the ICC, it fell a little bit in line with this revolutionary euphoria. And so the ICC fixed its gaze firmly on the former regime members, but had failed to send out any strong signals of a more even-handed justice in the Libyan situation. So after it indicted senior Gaddafi figures, it seemed as if everything goes until very recently with the indictment of Warfali. So let me just end with a more optimistic note, because having said all that, this is pessimistic, but all is not lost. But I think in order to arrive at the solution, we have to be accurate about the diagnostics. So in order to have a solution, in fact, you have to go back to this notion of a social contract. And Libya, I believe, needs a national dialogue process that allows them to find a political formula that works for their society, and that is inclusive. I'm thinking more of Tunisia than of Egypt in this case. Also, I believe, and also Siraj has referred to this recently, and also Ghassan Salameh, the new SRSG, there needs to be a roadmap to national reconciliation. And now, what should that look like? I think a few quick things. One is there should be much more focus on victims than there has been to date. So IDPs, also war wounded fall amongst this, but also victims in general need more focus in the Libyan context. There ought to be some form of amnesty and release of these 6,000 prisoners which have been held since the revolution. But one should not let go of the idea of accountability, because the role that people like Abdullah Sanusi played under the former regime, but also Warfali now, we can't just forget about it. And then finally, and ultimately, Libyans need a process to come to a national narrative that confronts Gaddafi's legacy, but that also then relegates it to history, and that doesn't stay stuck in that moment. And do I think all of this is possible, or is it hopelessly naive? I think it's possible.
Well, thank you for ending on that optimistic note. Thank you very much, Marika, for that. I want to pick up on a few points before we hear from our audience members who have, I imagine, questions and also comments to make. Starting with what Abdul Salam said earlier. He believes that in the case of Yemen, we cannot talk about transitional justice when there's an ongoing war. And do you disagree with that, Fresh? Why?
أعتقد أنه الموضوع العدالة
I think the question of transitional justice is not just a decision you take. Transitional justice is a process, as Noha said, and it's a consequence to an act of balancing of power and on the ground. Of course, there should be some enduring, constant principles, which makes me think that any kind of transitional justice should lead to a process of reconciliation and eventually a new social contract that everybody's talking about. The transitional justice will be present in every debate, in every negotiation. Of course, it has been for some time. There was a committee which did tremendous work, and the United States decided that there should be an investigation into the violations of human rights in Yemen. And this is something, whether we're talking about a committee, a fact-finding inquiry, or any form of investigation, transitional justice is not necessarily a sequence of stages. They are all interlinked, and one continues and adds to the previous one. Can people in Yemen, in view of the GCC initiative, and whether or not that initiative was right in providing Ali Abdullah Saleh with immunity from prosecution or not, whether that was right or wrong, this will be present in any debate. And also the role of the international community and its impact on the process. There is a negative impact and a positive impact. In the question of Yemen and Syria, when there is no possibility of reaching a solution, then the international community should push towards finding such a solution in accordance with the international law.
Point, which is that Yemen has been experiencing war for a long time. This is not new. So when you say we can't talk about transitional justice unless the violence subsides, when is that? I mean, why do you feel that it's important that there is peace before we can talk about justice?
Of course, what I'm talking about, I'm basing what I say on two important points, and maybe I didn't have time in my opening remarks to allude to them. When we had the National Dialogue Conference, which dealt with 6 very thorny issues, number 5 on the agenda was transitional justice. And the committee in the National Dialogue Conference issued a draft resolution for national reconciliation, which was all about transitional justice. The situation is not related to any laws or draft laws or any culture of transitional justice in the context of Yemen. The question is, who can apply this transitional justice in the absence of a state which can do that, which can establish special tribunals? Now we have no state. We don't have a judiciary. We don't have an executive arm of the state. We don't have anything. So how can we talk about transitional justice? I think all what we can do now is sort of educate the people about the importance of these things. But to do something practical will be almost impossible in the absence of the state.
Ask there, who can apply transitional justice when there is no functioning state? Which brings me to the question about the role of the international community in helping pursue justice in this region. There seems to be a double standard. It's not consistent, the way the international community has reacted in these various conflicts. In Libya, we saw them refer the Libya situation to the ICC. In Syria, there was a veto at the Security Council. What role, what should be the role of the international community in helping these countries pursue transitional justice?
Well, I mean, this is a really big question. I mean, I think, So, I mean, the ICC specifically is meant as a last resort, right? It's meant to be complementary to local processes.
Right.
And as you rightly point out, the international community as a whole has been, dare I say, hypocritical in the sense that, I mean, there's this thing called the global accountability norm, and there's talk about a justice cascade, and that may be true, to a certain extent, but, in Libya, the ICC, the Security Council referred the Libyan situation to the ICC. It did not. It did the complete opposite in Yemen, and in Syria, as we know, it's been vetoed. I mean, the thing about these international tribunals is they are also limited. So if a situation is to be, referred to the ICC, they are limited in who they pursue. So they go after, high level, command responsibility. They go after the.
But in the case of Libya, for instance, they haven't necessarily gone after the most deserving, if you will, perpetrators, have they?
What do you mean?
Well, some people say that the people that have been, brought forward are people whose arrests were easy for the ICC.
In Libya?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I would disagree with that because look at Saif Gaddafi, right? I mean,
right.
That's the thing. Who is going to transfer? Who will arrest these people? Whether it's Saif Gaddafi, whether it's the Sudanese president Omar Bashir, who's had an ICC arrest warrant since 2009, whether it's hypothetically Bashar al-Assad or anyone really, who will arrest them and who will transfer them to The Hague? That's the first challenge. Secondly, if I was tortured by a mid-level police officer, the ICC is not going to prosecute that mid-level police officer. It's going to prosecute, a head of state or a former minister and so on. And so this is why national efforts, are important because you would probably see sort of more of these mid-level police officers being prosecuted. And so, I mean, it's the international community should be complementary. I think that, you asked what should it do? I mean, I think there should be more engagement with local civil society, with victims, really.
Okay. Well, Marika, do you want to follow up on that a little bit, since you've worked extensively with the international community and the UN?
Yeah, I largely agree with what's been said. I think, first of all, it's important to remember that transitional justice, by definition, has to be a national process because it's a society's own attempts to come to terms with its legacy. And now, in some cases, domestic actors can be assisted or facilitated in this by the international community. And in a sense, the accountability piece of the puzzle is a bit de-linked from the national process. So we have an ICC, we have commissions of inquiry through the Human Rights Council, we have various other mechanisms. We have now an international, independent, impartial mechanism for Syria to facilitate domestic prosecution. So the accountability issue will stay, and it's a little bit like water running down a hill. You almost can't stop it because the victims will keep demanding that something is done. At the same time, in order for a process to really succeed, as was the case in South Africa, or now perhaps in Colombia, to some extent in Tunisia, it needs to be a domestic process. And the ICC will never be the institution to tip that balance. I don't believe that. Okay. It can contribute to the accountability, but it will not round off the experience.
Okay, interesting. So listen, let's now, I guess, open up questions to the floor. If you have remarks to make about what you've heard so far, or a specific question to any of our panelists, please feel free to. I think we have a microphone somewhere. A couple of hands raised already. We'll get to you in just a second. Let's just get the microphone. Let's start with the gentleman in the front here, please. Please keep your questions short if you can, your remarks short, so that we can get a chance to hear everyone.
Good evening for all. We hear about Yemen, Tunisia, but we didn't hear about Syria or Egypt.
I believe we did a little bit, didn't we?
No, of course, because there is no peace or justice in the Arab countries, we have to confess this, only despotism, only corruption, supported by free world, I mean Western countries. And the coup d'etat which happened in Egypt, he killed 10,000, 180,000 jailed, and he's supported by European and America. I think Trump is praising him every time. So we see Gulf countries also are financing all acts which supporting the Arab Spring. The external interference, Russia is coming to kill us. You know that Daesh now are paying $500 million to fight Daesh. If we consume this in developments in our countries, it will make 20 million jobs in our countries.
Okay.
Then we will grow.
So do you have a specific question then for the panelists, or did you just want to?
I have. So if everything is gloomy, there is no question. I mean, the free countries is doing everything for her interests, not principles.
Okay.
That is all.
Let's Noha respond to that. The international community, the role of the US in Egypt, for instance.
Well, I mean, I believe our audience member here basically echoed what was just said, in that, you know, there's no consistency really at the international level. I'm not sure what else I can add to that.
Anyone else want to pick up on what the gentleman just said? No? Okay. Well, thank you for sharing your views with us, sir. Thank you. Next question for the lady in the second row.
Hi, thank you for your views. But the big question is, did we really succeed today?
Did we what?
Did we really succeed the goals of the transitional justice? Has it been accomplished in these countries, whether it is Tunisia, Egypt, and currently? I can't see this, sorry, from a humble point of view.
Okay, Fresh?
What we talked about is 2011, 2012, that was 4 or 5 years ago. Today, what is the situation?
Fresh.
Yeah. Well, لم نتحدث على نجاح أو
We have not talked about whether these experiences are successful or not successful. What we talked about is what is present, what is available, and we tried to see how these things came through and came about. We cannot say that there is a successful story so far, even when it comes to the Tunisian experience. Yes, there are some achievements, but when we talk about a state of war in Syria, Libya, or Yemen, or the fact that these reforms have not gone through in Yemen and Bahrain. So when we talk about Tunisia, we relatively talk about some hope of a success. And this is not going to be a model to be followed by other countries, because each country has its own circumstances, has its own particularity that would make of it a successful story or not a success or a failure. We're talking about a number of tracks, a number of experiences. This is due to the fact that there are some different circumstances in those countries. We have had also interventions by the military establishment. We have seen the imposition of a number of agreements without taking into account the victims in those countries and also the communities and also national interests of those countries. And sometimes the situation is positive, such as in Tunisia. The role by the CSOs was very positive. They gave support without interference in the internal matters when it comes to expertise, institutions, or financial support. But in other countries, we have seen interventions in order to be inimical to the process of moving towards democracy. And the reason behind that is the interests, and not the interests of the country, but the interests of the international community. As for the Yemen, the crimes that are being committed now, and the most recent report has been issued, these are war crimes. They rise to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and this is the result of the bombardments, air bombardment that is taking place, and we know who is carrying out these bombardments. So these matters, Nuha talked about them, and she said that Nuha said that the process started in 1974 and it is still ongoing. So we have to continue being hopeful. We have to continue being optimistic, as the second speaker, Marika, said.
In the back row, please. Thank you.
Can I speak, ask Arabic?
Yeah. سؤالي لميريكا. The question is for America. So, America, you talked about referring the Libyan dossier to the ICC. I was hoping that I would be able to know what happens backstage in the different commissions, UN commissions. Did they talk about the irony of referring the case to the ICC and not referring the Syrian dossier to the ICC? We know that there are so many violations that have been committed in Syria. There were much more atrocities in Syria compared to Libya. In backstage in those commissions, have there been any talks about this kind of irony, this contradiction in terms of the position that have been taken? So how did they look into each other's eyes when they talked about referring the case of Libya and not referring the case of Syria?
Marika, what goes on behind the scenes? I mean, how do they address these contradictions?
I mean, to be fair, I think, as you remember, the Libya referral was a Security Council referral because Libya was not a member of the ICC. And the same would have to happen in Syria. So that essentially means that, of course, the politics of the Security Council dominate. Now, you're speaking to someone from a country who was very frustrated that the Syria case has not been referred to the ICC. And in fact, at some point, there was a letter of 54 states, I think, if I'm remembering right, headed by Switzerland, who asked for a referral of the Syrian file to the ICC. I think there are many people in the UN system who have been battling very, very hard to get accountability for Syria. And in fact, the result is, of course, the bypassing of the Security Council and action through the General Assembly to set up the IIIM. Now, incidentally, the IIIM, it may seem as if it's a little bit different than ICC and somehow a second choice, but I don't think so. I think, in fact, it's a very, very interesting new model that allows 50 staff to really focus only on Syria and to try to find the best ways to bring prosecutions around the world for Syrian accountability. So I'm not sure that that's much worse than the ICC, because the ICC, as we know, usually only tries 3 or 4 people per situation, does not have a staff focused on any particular country, and then also has the same limitations of arresting people, etc., as the IIIM does. So I do think Syrian accountability is high on the agenda. It is for the Netherlands. I know it's for the government of Qatar and others present here today. And I think we have to keep working towards that.
And perhaps explore other avenues than the United Nations Security Council, when you have a veto-wielding member of the Security Council that supports one of the sides in the conflict. It always makes it a bit more complicated, doesn't it?
And that's why it went to the General Assembly. But they came with at least a partial solution. So.
Yes. Okay, next question, please. To the gentleman in the front row here with the red tie.
Thank you. First of all, by the way, I'm Colombian.
Very good.
That's why I'm going to speak from the experience that my country is going through right now. Transitional justice. And our president, by the way, he was granted the Nobel Prize just in order to back up the process that my country is going on right now. Okay, but in there we have a divided society. Totally divided society. 50% back up the president, 50% back up the opposition. And because they do not see transitional justice as a way, to judge the guerrilla, all right? So is it transitional justice somehow losing some justice itself? This question goes to Noha, because I see that the people in there, they are not happy with transitional justice. In my country, they are not happy because they see, for instance, now the head of the guerrilla is in the parliament. Mm-hmm. They are in the parliament. So, and because they say there is no justice in here. Mm-hmm. So, is transitional justice somehow losing some justice?
That's a very interesting question. In Colombia is actually a very interesting example, isn't it? I mean, the pursuit of transitional justice, reconciliation, but the majority of the population wants justice first and not reconciliation. How does that? How does it play into the region, in this region in particular? How would that play?
Yeah, I mean it's a great question, really. I mean I think transitional justice, as I said earlier, it's used on the one hand by whether it's the elites, whether it's the interim governments, the post-transition governments, to unfortunately entrench their authoritarian hold on power, but it's also a very important mechanism for victims. So I mean it's it would be difficult to go to go up to a victim and say, you know what, now's just not the time. We don't have the right political will. We don't have the right mechanisms in place to seek justice. Just wait, just wait until things kind of calm down, maybe in 2 years, maybe in 50 years. What's interesting about Colombia is, this referendum, right? It was literally about peace or justice, right? And this was what, 50 years later?
50 years civil war.
After 50 years civil war.
Yeah.
And it's still, as you pointed out, a very contentious issue. And maybe it raises some really important questions about, what is it, how helpful is it to look at the situation in terms of peace or justice? Right. What other avenues are there? And then just sort of bringing the conversation back to Syria.
Right.
It's the most documented war in history, apparently,
Indeed.
right?
Yeah.
And so all this documentation, doesn't necessarily mean that it will only go towards prosecutions. No, I mean, it could go to, a truth commission, could go to reparations, it could go simply for, some sort of national dialogue, some sort of, reconciliation process. And so that conversation with victims in particular and their input, their input in the process is extremely important to avoid a kind of situation where you still have a polarized society that can't agree on a way forward.
Can I just add a small thing to
Sure.
that? Just to say, I think actually Colombia will provide an example going forward, because I think in Colombia what they've understood is that justice is about more than prosecutions. And the victim is really central to the Colombian process. They were even present at the talks. The people who voted against the peace agreement were not necessarily the victims. Many of them were the more elite living in cities who are less affected by the conflict. I think that's important to remember. I think the path they've chosen in Colombia is a very wise one and has a lot to teach to the rest of the world because of this broad definition of justice.
Okay, thank you. Before we take another question from the audience, I just want to bring in Abdul Salam to talk a bit more about Yemen. And Abdul Salam, the role of Yemenis outside of your country, because many have fled over the years because of the civil war and the current conflict in world. What role does the Yemeni diaspora play in working towards some form of accountability for all the grievances and atrocities that have been committed in their country?
If we go back to the UN resolutions that have been issued under Chapter 7, so the country that has been enjoying so many resolutions in a very limited period of time. So we had so many resolutions that have been issued and that have imposed sanctions on the head of the Houthis and the commander and Ali Abdullah Saleh and his son. But were these resolutions useful? And as my colleague has said, she said that transitional justice should come from the community, but we have seen from the international community there was blatant interference by the regional powers, and the situation was a result of a regional kind of crisis. Hollanda, they issued a draft kind of law in order to form a commission for the violations, an inquiry, commission of inquiry for the violations that have been taking place in Yemen. So this is a kind of a support, but the matters are going out of control of the regional powers into the international community. All these things are not going to find solution in Yemen. They are going to aggravate the situation even further. And if we try to say that we can maybe try to rebuild the state, this is going to be very important. There are millions of Yemenis in the diaspora, maybe as displaced people inside Yemen, or those who have left the country altogether after the beginning of the war. Those people in the diaspora, they have capital, they have resources, financial resources, and so many of them have become academic experts. They have high degrees. All of them can contribute to raising awareness and educating people, work in order to achieve transitional justice, and also can cooperate with so many agencies, particularly in rescue, in aid. We'd like to talk about the fact that Yemenis should stay alive before we talk about a transitional justice. So many people are dying, let alone establishing a transitional kind of justice. There are so many epidemics, so many illnesses. So we have so many children who are out of school. Some of them have been enlisted in the militias. We have 6 million students who cannot be schooled. We have so many schools that are closed. Out of 6 million, maybe 100,000 are going to join the militias. 100,000, that means it is going to be a gloomy future for Yemen. So that is why we have to concert our efforts with the international community when it comes to rescue, for the stability of Yemen, even a partial kind of stability in Yemen through health, education, and the basic services of the state. And after that, we can gradually start finding a solution. I think this is not going to be achieved by those who are inside Yemen, but by those outside Yemen. Yeah.
Let's take a few more questions from the audience. The lady in the 4th row there, please. Right there.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to commend all of the panelists this evening for tackling what truly is a courageous topic, particularly in these times and particularly in this region. We've had a view from Colombia, which I think is extremely helpful, and I'd just like to add a view here from Northern Ireland, which is where I'm based. And somewhat similarly, I think, to Colombia, as part of our peace process, transitional justice has been both an impediment and an opportunity to moving from conflict to peace, but then also to post-peace. And I think that our panelists made a very astute series of points when they spoke about the need for, at least for democratic or legitimate institutions to help with the transitional process. And certainly in Northern Ireland, that's made some of those steps along the path of transitional justice so much easier. However, in Northern Ireland, we too are stuck in our post-peace process. Our government is no longer functioning at present, and we're back under direct rule. And in many respects, the problem centers on the victims. And the inability, even with the support of democratic institutions and the European Union, to build peace, our inability to deal with our past and a way in which to find truth and true reconciliation for victims. So I wonder what our panelists think about those prospects for victims of injustices, not just in terms of the conflicts that have broken out since the Arab Spring, but in terms of those victims who have endured decades of injustice living under authoritarian regimes. Thank you.
Who wants to tackle that one? Noha?
Sure. Thank you, Beverly, for that question. It's an important point, and I think, you know, when you say that, you know, transitional justice has been both an impediment and also a helpful mechanism in Northern Ireland, I think that, you know, a lot of the perceptions of transitional justice depend on how you define, what are your expectations of transitional justice, and who is, you know, who is implementing it, and whose vision is being implemented here. And it really just goes back to, you know, the point that transitional justice is a process. I think it's very helpful to look at it as a process, but I think it's very important to also ask what is to be gained out of transitional justice. Are we looking at institutional reform, simply that, or are we, you know, are we looking for an endpoint of a democratic transition? Now, I don't think that's helpful in the case of the Arab region. And, you know, I mean, in the Arab Spring itself, I'm not sure that people really knew what kind of a transition that they wanted to begin with. So if we don't know what the term transition means, then how can we, you know, agree on what transitional justice should
be? And Fresh, also, what about this question of addressing the injustices pre-Arab Spring, before the Arab Spring? Because we're talking about now, you know, the last 6-7 years, but crimes were committed, human rights were abused way before the Arab Spring. What progress, what has been achieved? Has that been addressed at all?
There are attempts, in fact, which were being made in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. If we go back in history a little bit, all the attempts were aimed at tackling the violations before the Arab Spring. And all the attempts now, whether we're talking about Bahrain or Egypt or even Tunisia, everybody seems to be talking not about the event itself, but the previous era. Because what, after all, pushed people to go out on the street? They were calling for equality, dignity, justice, freedom. So the current regimes were the very regimes which stopped people from practicing these rights and denied them these rights. Unfortunately, however, when it comes to a balance between peace and justice in situations like Syria, Yemen, and Libya, this situation which we ended up in led to a total stalemate. What should we do? Because people could not make up their minds one way or another, more victims fell. And what happened in Iraq after 2003 is more than what happened under the Saddam Hussein regime. What in Syria, the number of people killed after the revolution is much more than before. If we take the Tunisian example, I think the scope is we should deal to or investigate the period from independence until now. And this should be a review or a rewriting of the history of a people and the recognition that these are victims. And also they're not guilty, they are victims because through their sacrifices national dignity was being restored. And justice can take different forms, like, for example, recognizing the victims as victims, compensation, also not necessarily by justice we should mean punishing people. Shukran. No.
And then we'll have to wrap up because we have gone on for a while now. The lady in black in the front row, please.
Okay, I'm going to ask my question in Arabic.
باللغة العربية I'm directing my question to you, Mr. Abdul Salam. And Noha spoke about international, about transitional justice. Mr. Abdul Salam, you said there is no tribal justice, there is no state, and the hope that when we saw Mubarak in a cage, the hope has diminished. I'm asking you, where are you getting your optimism from? You keep saying it's a process, and there is optimism. In the name of youth, I ask you, where are you getting this optimism from? It wasn't the youth who lived through a different patch before the revolution. The history is an ongoing process. It does not stop. The struggle between the different powers now, at this very moment, the struggle is not going in the favor of achieving transitional justice. Yet there will come a time when it will, and Argentina spent more than 20 years, despite the amnesties to generals. 20 years later, the same generals were tried. Pinochet was tried despite the amnesty. This is where I get my optimism from.
You have to stay positive. Okay, one last question. One last question from the gentleman next to the lady, please.
Thank you. Ashraf Siddiqui. Ongoing blockade of Qatar by 4 states, including Egypt, is resulting in a very severe victimization of the people here. What impact you think or you expect on the fragile process of the transitional justice in the region, especially Yemen and Syria?
Especially?
Yemen and Syria.
Yemen and Syria.
The impact of the blockade on the transitional justice in the countries that are in conflict right now, Yemen and Syria. Fresh?
With all due respect, I think you have just forced this question into the theme of our debate. I don't see any relation between the so-called Gulf crisis, which is not manifested in the blockade only, but it involves many other issues. What I see, however, is that there will be an impact on the conflict in Yemen and Syria, yes, because this Gulf crisis will impact events in Yemen, but not on transitional justice, however.
Let's do the back row now, because we've done the front row. Sorry. We'll do the gentleman in the back row. Right there, yes.
تحية. طالما
As long as transitional justice is dependent on international will, which is governed by the right of veto, will there be within the civil society organization some sort of brainstorming to provide the ICC with the tools it needs, which will be enabling it to act away from the veto? I want to remind the audience that there are criminals in Europe for about 35 years, like Rafat al-Assad, for example, who was the leading commander in the crimes committed in Hama. He killed thousands of people. Until now, he lives in palaces in Europe without any justice. In addition, the YouTube has of late deleted many videos which document the crimes committed by the Bashar al-Assad regime, and unfortunately we didn't see any civil movement within the civil society organization against that.
Who wants to pick up on that, Marika or Noha?
I can say something.
Go ahead, I'll add something
Yeah.
there.
No, I think that the issue here is that the ICC is not the only path to justice. I think the ICC is an institution with limitations, but we have to keep exploring other avenues to justice. And I think, obviously, of this individual you mentioned, would anyway fall outside the ICC because these are crimes from long ago, doesn't mean that there are no other opportunities to try to get accountability for those crimes. And the documentation in Syria, the YouTube issue, I hope there's some way for YouTube to reconsider what it does with that material, that even if it doesn't post it on the internet, it may still be able to share that material with the IIIM that was created for accountability for Syria. So I think, indeed, the civil society is usually the one who's most consistently pursuing accountability through documentation and through advocacy, and it should continue that role for all such cases.
Noha will give you the last word.
Sure,
This is the last word.
Sure. I just wanted to add, so it's important to remember that even before the Arab Spring, civil society, whether it was Tunisian civil society or Egyptian civil society and so on, but especially in Tunisia, did succeed in filing criminal cases against former ministers. For example, Abdullah Qalal, who's the former Minister of Interior in Tunisia, there was a criminal case filed against him in Geneva, if I'm not mistaken, for his role in the torture of some officers in Barakat al-Sahel, right, in 1991. So this was an incident that happened in 1991, and this case, I think, was filed in 2001 in Geneva. And what's interesting is that this case was silent for a while because of the difficulties in sort of, arresting Abdullah Qalal and so on, but it reemerged after the Arab Spring happened in Tunisia, and he was tried and he was convicted for, I think, he was given a 9-year prison sentence, which I think has now disappeared. But, that aside, that's just one example of several, actually, and there was a case in Egypt as well with Khalid Said that started from before the Arab Spring. It wasn't in Europe, but it was domestic. And so civil society has really been, the champion of this cause for decades, from before the Arab Spring even started. And it's continuing, and it's got this institutional memory, right? Which is very important. So.
Okay, thank you so very much for a very interesting discussion. It was certainly enlightening. You want to add one last word, Abdussalam?
One simple point regarding civil society organizations. The West should understand that civil society should work in parallel with the state and not an alternative to the state. What we see in some countries now, civil society is treated as an alternative to the state, and they get the kind of support on equal footing like states, and this is a very serious manner. Because in the absence of a state, the whole thing can turn into a commercial exercise.
For a very interesting discussion. Thank you for some great questions from the audience. Really appreciate your thoughts, your insight on this issue, which I'm sure we'll be talking about for some time, given the situation in the region. Please stay with us for a little reception, and if you want to order a copy of Noha's book, you can do that outside. And thank you. Look forward to the next discussion. Thank you to the Brookings Doha Center for organizing this. Thank you very much.
And thank you for your.
Thank you very much.